The America's Quarterly Podcast is sponsored in part by Florida International University's Jack D. Gordon Institute. Since 1985, the Institute has been at the forefront of innovation in cybersecurity, national security, and public policy. You can dive into their vast library of Latin American security-focused research, explore their academic and professional programs, or tap into their open-source data initiatives. Learn more at go.fiu.edu/impact. Welcome to the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. This month will mark the 50th anniversary of Augusto Pinochet's coup in Chile. In today's episode, we'll explore how that tragedy continues to reverberate in modern-day politics, illustrating the persistent divide between Chile's ideological left and right.
I think it is notable that we now have, in a way, this passing of the baton. We have an older generation that's beginning to leave the political scene, and we have Boric and the new generation that's coming onto the political scene and trying to make some sense of this. Now, the problem is, in that whole dynamic, we do not seem to have managed to find a path forward. We have not seemed to manage to take the experience of the past, the errors of the past, and agree on, this is what needs to happen going forward. Even a basic minimum of agreement on what the coup means.
On September 11, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet ordered a coup against the democratically elected socialist president, Salvador Allende. Today's president, Gabriel Boric, wasn't alive back then. He's only 37. But he has made the commemoration of that awful chapter in Latin American history a major moment in his government, talking often about the coup, paying homage to Allende, and also taking several initiatives to atone for the past, at least partially, including a new effort to try to locate the remains of more than 1,100 victims of the regime who were never located. This could have been a moment of reflection, of democratic consensus across the political spectrum, and yet, according to people on the ground, it doesn't really feel that way, in part because of the current state of Chilean politics. Indeed, polls suggest public opinion about Pinochet's dictatorship is changing. In 2005, an average of 24% of Chileans thought that the military was right in carrying out the coup. Today, that number has gone up to 36%, reflecting perhaps popular frustration with modern-day challenges like crime and immigration, but also the deep divisions between left and right that remain present in Chilean society. In today's episode, we'll talk about the anniversary's meaning in today's Chile while keeping one foot firmly rooted in today's politics. What is the current state of Chile's democracy? How worried should we be by some of this polling? What are the real divisions in today's Chilean politics? And what does it all mean for issues including a proposed new constitution? Joining us as our guest is our friend and regular contributor, Robert Funk, who wrote a great essay on the 50th anniversary recently for America's Quarterly. He's an associate professor at Universidad de Chile. Robert, welcome to the AQ Podcast.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
So, Robert, what does the way this anniversary is being commemorated tell us about today's politics in Chile?
So it's interesting because if you think back 20 years to the 30th anniversary, when Ricardo Lagos was president, the first socialist president since Allende, and, there was a lot of symbolism there, and Lagos really handled it with a lot of, obviously Lagos was quite criticized by the right, by the private sector, and he ended up really using the anniversary to kind of reach out. The 40th anniversary took place, I believe it was Sebastián Piñera. Again, kind of a different situation because now we had a right-wing president. And again, he used it to kind of talk about the future, to talk about, he even said some things that for a right-wing president were rather extraordinary and probably cost him a little bit in his own base. And what's happened now is that we have a very, after everything that Chile has gone through in the last few years, really Chile's in a very different place. It's feeling nervous, it's feeling insecure, it's very uncertain about the future. And of course, we have this president who looks towards the past in a very distinct way. I remember many years ago, the satirical magazine, The Clinic, came out, its front page, and it had a caricature of Salvador Allende, and it said something like Salvador Allende superstar. And Allende had these sort of glasses, and it was what I call the T-shirt version of Allende. And I think a lot of the people in power today, which sort of like the T-shirt version of Che Guevara, right? And I think a lot of the people in power today look at the T-shirt version of Allende as not necessarily as a political model, but it's just a symbol. It's an identity thing. The 50th anniversary is taking place today at that level, much more than a political level. It's taking place at the level of kind of identity. It's, I identify with this superstar Allende, or, maybe amongst the old generation, it's, well, I remember what the real Allende was like, and things weren't so great, and it's unfortunate what happened, and it's a tragedy, and so there's very, very mixed feelings. It's very difficult, and I think there's almost no way for President Boric really to grab onto this in a way that would be meaningful to his base, to younger people that have one view of the past, to older people that have another view of the past, to the victims of the dictatorship who have a very strong view of the past and who are still trying to come to terms with it, and to a country that really has not come to terms with it, and I think in a way that has allowed us to move forward, and that explains why we are where we are.
It's interesting that this anniversary is being commemorated so much more than the others, as you point out. And on one level, that makes sense. 50th anniversary is always important. But it's also fascinating that the president who's overseeing this is, unlike the other figures that you named, former presidents Lagos, Piñera, and others, he's the first one who wasn't even alive when the coup happened. He's 37, so it's actually not even close. But he's devoted so much attention to this. Why?
Well, again, I think for a good part of his base, there's some symbolism there. The 50th anniversary is also in many ways the last anniversary, the last big anniversary that will include the protagonists. I think it's very important that we continue commemorating, that we continue remembering, and every year we do so. And that's, we do so with the Second World War, with the Holocaust, right? That's important to remember. But I think it is notable that we now have, in a way, this passing of the baton, that we have an older generation that's beginning to leave the political scene, and we have Boric and the new generation that's coming onto the political scene and trying to make some sense of this. Now, the problem is, in that whole dynamic, we do not seem to have managed to find a path forward. We have not seemed to manage to take the experience of the past, the errors of the past, and agree on, this is what needs to happen going forward. Even a basic minimum, of agreement on what the coup means. And in fact, President Boric tried to push the political sector to sign a kind of cross-party declaration of a minimum kind of commitment to democracy and condemnation of the coup and of violence and so on. And that wasn't possible. And I think that speaks volumes of our political moment and how difficult it's going to be, not only to come to terms with the past, but then, what do we do with a new constitution? How do we design a new political system going forward?
Let's talk about the other side of the debate here, and you just alluded to it, these political groups that did not want to sign this declaration. As we stand here on the precipice of this anniversary, how is the right handling it? I mean, are there still groups that are defending Pinochet's legacy and saying things that, maybe there were abuses, or certainly there were abuses, but the coup may have been justified? Who are these actors? I mean, my sense a couple of years ago was that, with the exception of some very isolated corners of the Chilean right, nobody was really daring to defend Pinochet anymore. Has that now changed?
It's changed. What changed that mood or that situation were the protests of 2019. I think there was a kind of consensus in the country that it was just political suicide, or at the very least politically incorrect, to continue to defend Pinochet. I think what happened after Pinochet was arrested in London, and there were, things came to light, and there were certain legal cases that talked about how much money was stolen. And for many people on the right, sort of the last straw with regards to Pinochet was not the fact that he was responsible for death and exile and torture or in a dictatorship. It was the fact that he had stolen money. So there was a kind of consensus. And then came the protests. And I think it ignited in many people memories of the worst years of both the dictatorship and the pre-dictatorship, right? So the worst years of political division, lack of order, in the political groups actively calling for violence or using violence to achieve political objectives. And so that, I think, opened the doors for some people on the right to say, you see, the left never really changed. They still are committed to violence. And in fact, if you look at public opinion, public opinion actually does value, I mean, in Chile as in elsewhere, does value security, governability, and it looked like we were losing that. And I think that opened the door to some groups like Republicanos to come out and say, those people represent violence and revolution. We represent order and stability. And together with that comes a kind of corporate defense of the dictatorship. And you do have individuals. I don't think it's a kind of a group or I don't think there's the political parties as such have this language, but certainly individuals within the UDI, Renovación Nacional, Republicanos, so the parties of the right, there are some people who will not hesitate to say Pinochet was justified. You have to understand the context. The typical kind of language that at the end of the day everyone understands is justifying the coup.
Robert, we live in an era in Latin America where the political positioning of the military has become relevant again, certainly in cases like Brazil. How is the Chilean military reacting to this anniversary?
They are fairly quiet. It has changed over time, but I think the military really today, there's absolutely no fear or suspicion that the military would act in any way. People say, oh, Boric is in trouble and he's unpopular and, he's not going to finish his term. Maybe he may not finish. I don't think that'll happen. But if he does not finish his term, it won't be because of the military. It'll be because of some sort of censure in Congress or some other mechanism, which has been the more common thing in Latin America over the last few years rather than military action. I think the military has the sense that it paid a great cost, actually, a great price for the coup. It was instigated by, or it was encouraged, that the military was encouraged by civilian sectors, but the price was paid entirely by the military. And I don't think they're willing to do that again. So I think there's there's been 2 or 3 generations now of military officers trained in democracy and trained in respect for some degree of, human rights and so on. That's not an issue at all. But you do hear in the political sphere and in the kind of social sphere some language that, is a little bit worrying, that, that goes back a little bit to what Brian was saying about the respect for authority or the yearning for authoritarianism. But I don't think the military will listen to that.
It's interesting to me that this follows a recent period where, of course, we had a president in Brazil who tried his best to defend the previous dictatorship, stopped even using the word coup to describe what happened in Brazil in 1964, accompanied by something that's underway potentially right now in Argentina, which was a place to me where it seemed like, if there was one country in the region that was united behind a certain repudiation of the dictatorship years, it was Argentina. But now we see the vice presidential candidate for arguably the front runner in the election there has made a career so far out of relativizing some of the things that happened during the 1976 to 83 regime. What's going on? I know that you look at the region as a whole, just like we do and our audience does. What's happening here?
I would actually go beyond the region. I look at the world, right? Look at Italy, where you have, people justifying fascism. Look at the United States. So I think there is something happening in the world. Look at Vox in Spain, which now has not, in the recent elections, didn't do so well. But there was a moment where people thought there was a kind of return to or coming out of the closet of old style Spanish fascism. And so there's something going on in the world where many ideas that perhaps at some point would have been beyond the political pale are somehow, if they're not acceptable, at least there are groups that are willing to listen to this again. This is just a hypothesis, but I think there's a kind of backlash on the part of people who basically are very afraid of rapid political and social change that's taken place in the world in the last 20 years, of great social liberalization. And when you take that to the Latin American context, which generally has been a fairly conservative region, and you see tremendous progress even today, right, with respect to indigenous rights. There's a long way to go, but these issues are on the table: indigenous rights and gay rights and women's rights and issues of the environment and the different protests that Chile has gone through in the last 10 or 12 years. And if these protests were not just it wasn't just the protest of 2019. Before that, we had a protest for gay marriage. We had the women's huge women's movement 2 years before 2019. You had environmental issues, the student issue, of course. So what these are new groups trying to take part in the political process, to claim political power. And there's a backlash against that in Chile and in the rest of the world.
At the same time, Robert, this polling that I mentioned in the introduction about potentially support for authoritarian rule increasing, you argued in your recent piece for America's Quarterly that it might not be that Chileans are getting fed up with democracy itself, but that they're voicing a different kind of concern. Can you expand on that argument a bit?
I think the key point is that those polls tend to be, like all polls, they tend to be answered by people in the context of not just the time, but the moment. So they tend to reflect the Chilean people's yearning for order, for governability, and they tend to associate that more with the right than with the left. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that people are yearning for dictatorship. It means they're yearning for order, right? And we haven't mentioned, by the way, also another important point, which is crime, drugs, gangs, and all of that, which has made great inroads in Chile. And I think is actually, in the long term, probably a much bigger problem than the political problem, right? Because the political problem, you get new parties, new leadership, new constitutions, you can kind of fix that. And Chile has a strong institutional tradition that can fix that. I think this issue of crime, drug gangs, and so on, there's not a lot of examples around the region of countries that have successfully combated that. So I think people are yearning when people say we want order. That's their fear. It's not something necessarily that a dictatorship could resolve. But it is something, for example, that an authoritarian populist like Bukele could solve, maybe. And so maybe that's really what they're looking at, much more so than a yearning for the military past. Also, we haven't really talked about the constitutional process, right? So we had a constitutional proposal at the end of last year. In fact, we just commemorated the 1 year anniversary of the referendum which rejected that proposal. And that proposal was the result of a constitutional assembly that really was dominated by, I don't even want to say the left, because it's not, right and left are kind of meaningless in this. It was dominated by new groups, often by independent candidates who were taking their own identity-based issues or their own causes, and all these things got added onto this huge document, which I call the Christmas tree constitution, right? Everybody was hanging their baubles onto this. So rather than negotiate and come to some sort of consensus on what's going to be in this, everything just got added on. That scared the Chilean voters. In that context, I think people now, it looks like people are looking for what, in Chile they call mano dura, right? Sort of a tough stand or a tough hand.
But, confusingly, and this is where, those of us who follow Chilean politics, not on a day-to-day basis, but relatively closely, you just kind of want to throw up your hands because it looks like this new constitutional process written by people mainly from the right, dominated by the Republicanos party run by Jose Antonio Cast, as you've mentioned. The polling tells us that this one is potentially going to be rejected by the public as well. I mean, is the message here just that Chileans are fed up and they keep rejecting things that come in front of them, and it doesn't really matter what it is that they're going to vote no?
Well, I think, again, going around the world, there is an element of that. There's an element of throw the bombs out, right? Que se vayan todos. So there's an element of that. But I think in this particular case, I think the right and the extreme right, or the populist right under Cast, has overplayed its hand. I think there was an interpretation that their electoral victory or their relative success in electing and getting a majority in the new constitutional council meant that that's what Chileans were voting for. And I don't think that's what Chileans were voting for. In the same way that I don't think, for the most part, Chileans gave a huge majority and a resounding mandate to Boric in his presidential election. Boric was elected because people were afraid of Cast. In this particular case, the right obtained a majority in this council because they were fed up with the previous process. And what people really wanted was, it was very simple. And if you look at the slogans and the signs in the protests of 2019, what do you see? You see pensions, healthcare, cheaper medicine, better education. It was very clear what Chileans have been asking for all along. And it's not so clear that, in fact, they were asking for a new constitution. They were asking for very concrete results on social policy and on things that they felt were they were not getting a good deal or not getting, politicians were not listening. It was very clear what needed fixing. And then in the first constitutional process, you started saying things like, well, nature has rights. And, these things that people are saying, what are you talking about? You're going too far. And now the Republicanos sort of interpreted that they have this blank check to limit, for example, abortion rights, which is a gain that has been made in Chile over the past years. And Chileans saying, wait a minute, that's not what we voted for. We voted to fix healthcare, education, pensions. and suddenly they see the other side going too far. And so it's likely to be rejected again.
As we record this, though, it looks like the Republicanos have agreed to perhaps remove some of these more, I suppose you could call them right-wing proposals on subjects like abortion. Do you think that could have an impact, or has the public already made up its mind to vote no?
No, I think it could have an impact. On one level, I think Chileans are exhausted, right? This has been a long road. There will be a good sector of the electorate that is going to want to just resolve this. And if there's a document that seems somewhat reasonable, I suspect because it's clear that if this does not get approved now, on paper, what happens is that the existing constitution remains in place. But in practice, there will be pressures to probably, particularly from the left, to have another go at it. And that's just exhausting.
Well, so here's my question. I mean, do you see any scenario under which the Boric government supports this draft constitution, quote unquote, even though it was written or at least heavily influenced by Republicanos and the Cast crowd?
I think that if they manage to return the draft to what the committee of experts designed a few months ago, I think it will be much easier for President Boric to support it. If it crosses certain limits, for example, on women's rights, those kinds of things I think would make it very difficult for Boric to support it. And again, that's very complicated for Boric, right? It's very complicated to have gone through all of this, to have basically almost based your presidential campaign on and your political career on the need for a new constitution and say, yeah, but not this one. I think Republicanos, the reason that they're backtracking on some of these more radical things is that they understand, and Cast certainly understands, that his political future is at stake here, right? If they propose something that is too radical, they will make the mistake that Vox made in Spain, particularly with women. I think, the abortion issue is something that will scare women off, not just with respect to the Constitution, but with respect to this political party, that political sector in the elections coming up in the next 2 or 3 years.
Robert, as we move to the end here, I want to try to look ahead, recognizing that this is an episode built around, a 50th anniversary. But you've referenced throughout our conversation just how tumultuous the last 4 years have been. And I have had this perhaps unreasonable optimism throughout the whole process. I have said, yes, it's messy, but gosh, look at Chile, this very strong democracy led by a new generation of leaders, handling these existential questions through a democratic process. This is something that should be celebrated. And I have believed that, we'll come out of this one way or another, not only intact, but perhaps with a framework that will allow Chile to continue progressing towards its dream, which is essentially attaining developed world status, right? I mean, it's not that far off as we sit right now, but that's the way that things could conceivably go. But listening to you and reading some of this polling and things over the last couple months, I wonder, I wonder if we're just sitting here looking at a country that is very, very divided, as it was 50 years ago, as it has been throughout most of its history since, and unable to come to the kinds of basic agreements that are necessary for a democratic society to move forward. Which of those scenarios are you closer to right now?
Andres Velasco and I have written a little bit about the protest of 2019 and why a country that looked like it was on its way towards development seems to have strayed from that path. And if you look at the literature, all the sort of Acemoglu and Robinson and why nations fail and all these kinds of, there's all sorts of literature on what happens to countries that seem to be on the cusp and don't make it, or the middle income trap. There's all sorts of concepts out there. And I think it's true that Chile still is in this kind of space where it has some decisions to make as to whether it continues along the path towards development and first world status, as you say, or whether it regresses. It's not at all clear to me that it is willing to make the kinds of choices needed to keep progressing. And part of that has to do with, as you say, the inability to reach a consensus not only on the past, but a consensus on the future. When Chile did well during the Concertación years, it's because there appeared to be a consensus with respect to the future. There appeared to be a consensus with respect to consensus, right? There appeared to be a consensus on the importance of reaching political agreements. That's now gone. And it's gone in many parts of the world, including the United States. There's a strong line within the new left and within the new right that is much more suspicious of sort of the liberal international commercial order and political order. And so Chile has to resolve that. So many of the consensuses that Chile appeared to have in the 1990s are weakening. That's because the world has changed, but it's also because, and this has to be said, what we thought was consensus was not really consensus, right? It was fear. It was a fear of authoritarian regression. It was the product of it was the end of the Cold War, and it was the 1990s, and everybody thought kind of that the ideological debate had ended, and it hadn't. So it was a kind of a bubble. And now Chile has to find a way, and one hopes that the constitutional process is that way of reaching a new consensus to decide how we're going to approach the future. It's not clear to me how that gets resolved in the near future. And the other side of that is just contentious politics.
Yeah, certainly lots of questions remain to be answered, although I certainly haven't lost hope, and it doesn't sound like you have either. So on that note, Robert, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks to you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced by Luisa Franco and edited in partnership with Human Group Media.